Well, we've been talking true and false questions this week, the last couple of weeks. Now I'm going to give you another one that we're just going to do one tonight because I've got I think we need to look at this. I think this is important. Forgive others quickly, true or false? As quickly as you can, okay? False, false?
In some things, it takes a while to forgive.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. The first, if you left out the word quickly, it'd be true, right? But you add the word quickly, and suddenly well, in some cases it's impossible. In some cases it's impossible. Let me give you an example, okay? If I step on your foot accidentally, as I'm trying to get by you, you're sitting in church, and I step on your foot, and I say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and you say, "No problem, no problem." That's what usually happens. But you don't, like, someone steps on your foot and hits your little toe or something, and they say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and you say, "Wait, give me a minute." Now that would be weird, right? That would be weird. The offense was small, it was easy to forgive, the hurt wasn't too bad. But if you physically abused me and then said, and you told me, "Oh, I'm sorry," it would be ridiculous for me to forgive you on the spot. If someone's been abusive to you, it would be ridiculous to say, "Okay, I forgive you right now," just like that. Now that just defies reason. It's not so easy to do that. And if you said that you were actually doing that, let's say, and here's a situation. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular. I'm thinking of several of women who've been abused in their marriages, okay? And they come in for counseling, and they're blaming themselves. They'll say, and I say, "Well, what's going on?" "Well, they asked me to forgive them." "Well, how long has this been going on?" "Oh, all of our married life. And it's getting worse," okay? Because abuse without intervention it will escalate all the time. I've never seen an exception to the rule. It doesn't stop escalating just because someone decides they're going to stop it. Something has to happen. Some intervention has to take place. Somebody gets arrested, somebody gets told on, and reported, and then necessary corrections are made that way because you're involving other people. But you just can't, a wife who would say, "Well, I forgave him when he asked me." I'll say, "Are you really I would want to know, are you really doing the hard work of forgiveness here?" This is a big deal if it's been going on for years. It's not the same as stepping on your little toe, okay? Or I would expect you to immediately forgive somebody. If someone's been beating you, or you might be repressing the sorrow, the anger, the wound. And I think in some cases, in an effort to be obedient to Jesus, people put themselves through quite a bit of misery and guilt, thinking they should immediately forgive for big things. And I'll use an example. Yes. Okay.
After Jesus was betrayed, do you think they forgave the betrayer immediately? It would have been very good.
Yes. Yeah.
And it might have been very difficult for a long, long time.
How long did it take God to make final provision for the forgiveness of our sins?
A bunch of years.
A lot of years. Now, there was an element of some forgiveness, wasn't there?
Oh, yeah.
we've been talking about this in ladies' Bible class, and I hadn't brought it up, but the penalty was, if you remember, if you eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, on that day you will surely die. But they didn't, did they?
The body may have started though.
Maybe. Well, as long as they had access to the tree of life, they would have continued to live. But he showed mercy because he was quite specific when he said, on that day you will surely die. God showed mercy. In some sense, he did forgive, but did he forgive completely until Jesus? No, not until Jesus died. Seems that all of those things, like sacrifices and such, were ways of reminding people of their sin. That's what the writer of Hebrews says. It's a reminder of sins year after year. Wasn't really taking care of the sin. So if you use God as an example, which we should in most cases, say, well, God doesn't even do that. He does it now because of the blood of Jesus. But it took a long time to get to that point. Imagine if you stabbed me in a rage with a kitchen knife in the back, because we've had an argument. Deb does this. And yeah, let's just say she does it to me. She stabs me at the back, and she said, and there with the knife hanging out of my back, and I'm starting to crumple to the ground, she says, oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. Well, I would want you to call the ambulance first. Spare me the apologies. Help me get better. Isn't that true of some of the wrongs that are done to us? They're like knives put in our backs. We need more than just an apology, okay? We need much, much more than that. I'm going to share a story with you tonight that you are familiar with. It's a story of long forgiveness, what I call long forgiveness. But I wanted to touch base. Let's go back to this one more time, the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, where in the prayer he asked God, forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And I skipped a verse there, for if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. I want to emphasize that forgiveness is an ongoing process. It's something you don't stop doing. And in some things, it takes a while. And I'm going to give you an example from the Old Testament of a long forgiveness. Joseph and his brothers. I want to share this story with you. We're going to read a few verses, but I went over the story very carefully, preparing for the lesson tonight. But I wanted to accurately relate the story to you with a particular look at the issue of forgiveness. Because in this story, the issue of forgiveness isn't explicitly mentioned, but it's the elephant in the room, okay? In this case, the elephant in the sheep herd, right? And it's interesting also that of all the things that happened in the book of Genesis, I think this gets more attention, Joseph and his brothers, than any one relationship, any family relationship. It starts in Genesis 37, and it goes clean through 14 chapters. 14 chapters of 50. It is a long story. Now, there's a few interruptions along the way. So what I did was I wanted to compact the story and condense it a bit for you. Now, to understand the depth of the wrong that was done, the beauty of this story is that the backstories of forgiveness are almost always complicated. Okay. That it's not just, somebody wronged me, therefore I need to forgive them. And that's the way sometimes I think it's presented in sermons. Well, somebody wronged me, I need to forgive them, so I'll forgive them. hey, that's not real life. And the Bible doesn't even treat that like real life. That's not the way it happens in real life. And the Bible recognizes that. And this is why this is one of the reasons I think this story is in here. Well, here's the backstory of this man, Joseph. He is Jacob's son who became Israel. Joseph had 4 mommies. I'm going to let you just think about that for a minute. Because you need to think about that for a minute. We need to think about that for a minute and how many problems that might cause. If you think that having 2 mommies who are not even living in the same house is complicated, imagine what it's like to have 4 mommies living in one encampment in the same household. 4. Now, Joseph was Rachel's son, but Rachel had a sister named Leah who was also in the household. And each of these women had slave girls who had children by Jacob. So you have 4 mommies. You know, I don't know of a book that says I have 4 mommies. No, but anyway, here's the backstory. Jacob, Joseph's dad, had been deceived into marrying both of these girls, Rachel and Leah. He loved the younger sister, Rachel, and he agreed with Rachel's dad that he would work 7 years for her, and he did. He worked for 7 years, and he was very good at what he did. And on the wedding day, the wedding night, they went into the tent, and as was the Middle Eastern custom, the bride was completely veiled. And so he had relations. He slept with her that night, lifted the veil, and guess what? It wasn't the one I love. It's Rachel. It's Leah. It's not Rachel. So he comes out. He stormed. I can only see this. He storms out of the tent. He goes to Rachel's daddy, Rachel's daddy Laban, and says, "Hey, Laban, what gives? I worked for Rachel. I did not work for Leah." And he says, "Well, we have a custom, and we never allow the younger sister to marry before the older one does." Now, the Bible doesn't tell you whether that's a real custom or not. Let's just say this. Let's just give Laban the benefit of the doubt. Laban was telling the truth. Let's say they didn't do that. Well, why in the world didn't Laban say something about that 7 years before? Okay. He didn't say it because he knew that Jacob probably wouldn't agree to it. All right. So he was deceived. Of course, Jacob himself was not exactly the nicest guy. You can read the first part of Genesis. He did a lot of deception and lying involving his dad and his brother and all that stuff. So Jacob was kind of getting his comeuppance here. So he says, so Laban says, "I'll tell you what, you have your wedding week with Leah, and I'll agree to let you work 7 more years for Rachel, and then you can have Rachel after the wedding week." So he didn't have to work another 7 years. He got her right after that week. So here's Leah, who gets a week of uninterrupted attention from her husband, albeit a reluctant, unloving husband. And then after that week, he clings to the one he loves, that he really loves, Rachel. Now you are sowing the seeds of all kind of discord in a family. I don't care how good these people are. These are just ordinary folks. And so you have Rachel and Leah, sisters. Yes, sisters. By the way, in the law of Moses, the Lord made it illegal to marry sisters. Did you know that? Under the law of Moses, it was illegal to marry sisters. And it was because of this. It doesn't say that, but I know it was because of this. All right? It was unlawful under the law of Moses to marry sisters. You're thinking, marry more than one woman? Yeah, right, I know. It was not it was permissible to marry more than one woman. It was not advisable. Polygamy was never encouraged, okay? But it was allowed, all right? It happened. So, but you were not allowed under the law of Moses to marry sisters after this happened. So, underneath all of this, all of these other issues that come into Joseph's life, Rachel's son, you have the two mamas to start with who are clearly at odds with each other and very competitive. Okay. They bore children, or I should say Leah bore children, she was very fertile, and she had boys, one right after the other. And Rachel, and this was wonderful. I mean, this was a sign of pride, a sign of, I look at me, look how productive I am, okay? And Rachel just cried out. She was just upset to no end. So she got desperate, and she gave Jacob her slave girl to have children, since she was apparently unable to have any. So her slave girl gave birth. Well, Leah had a few more children. Then Leah couldn't for a while, and then Leah gave Jacob her slave girl. So now we got 4 moms, 4 mothers of these children, and they ended up being in a childbirth contest for a significant amount of time. Rachel finally had a child. The last 2 children in this family were born by Rachel. All the other 10 boys and a daughter were born before Rachel started having kids. Rachel had a child, Joseph, who was born in Jacob's old age and was his pride and joy. Undiluted joy for Jacob. He was Jacob's favorite, and Jacob didn't do anything to hide it. Jacob had one more son by Rachel, Benjamin, but she died in childbirth while on the road. Had to bury her alongside a road, to give you an idea of the multiple levels of tragedy in that story. So it wasn't, so as special as Benjamin was, Jacob could not help but remember that it was Benjamin's birth that claimed his wife's life. Okay. There was no question Joseph was the favored one. Benjamin was the baby, but Joseph, the next to the youngest, was clearly the favorite. And so this is the ultimate nightmare blended family, okay? Without getting into the weeds too much, Joseph was on the outs with his older brothers, the sons of the other mothers. He was the oldest son of the favored mother. And so you had favoritism in this family, and favoritism can be deadly in a family no matter how you try to hide it. And it just nearly was deadly. This was very nearly a deadly problem. Joseph had a tendency to brag. He also had a tendency to tell the truth about his brothers. He brought his daddy a bad report about him. And that's how the story actually begins in Genesis 37, that Joseph goes and tells his daddy and gives a bad report about his older brothers who are out tending flocks. They're not doing their, whatever the problem is, he says he brought him a bad report. Well, that isn't a way to mend a family, is it? This family has already got problems, and now you've got this. They hated him for that. Oh, that's not the end of this. Joseph had dreams. He had dreams on top of that. So not only is he a rat for telling on his brothers, now he's a dreamer who thinks he's going to be better than the rest of the family. He's having these dreams. He has a dream about sheaves of wheat bound together in a field, and they're living. And he is one of those sheaves of wheat, and he rises up in the middle of them in his dream, while all of his brothers and family members are sheaves of wheat, and they all bow down to him. And he goes and tells his daddy about that. Another dream was similar. He said, the sun and the moon were bowing down to him, and the 11 stars all bowed down to Joseph. And so Jacob said, when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and says, what is this dream you've had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? And so Jacob saw this as poisoning the family. He needed to stop this. His brothers absolutely and totally hated him for this. It was jealousy. It was anger. They couldn't do anything without Joseph looking over their shoulder, taking bad reports. They were very jealous. And Jacob then made Joseph an ornate robe, a coat of many colors. We used to learn in King James Version, a coat of many colors. There's also a notion in the original language that this was a long-sleeved coat because he would have been an executive, not needing to use his hands. Say a short-sleeved cloak would indicate you're going to be a manual laborer like everybody else, but a long-sleeved coat would indicate you're going to be an executive. You're not going to have to work with your hands, you're going to work with your head. And so Jacob made his boy Joseph, I don't know that he made anybody else's coat, but he made Joseph one. And so his brothers saw this, and they saw him wearing that coat. And Jacob, for some reason, sends Joseph. I have a hunch I know why. He sends Joseph on an errand. And the errand is this. I need you to go check on your brothers. They're somewhere around Shechem. I want you to go check on your brothers and see how they're doing. They're tending the flocks. So, my theory of that is that Joseph was one to tell the truth about his brothers. He wasn't going to ice over the problems that they might be having out there. That Joseph will tell him the truth since he tattled on him before. So he sends Joseph out to check on him. Now, don't you think that they thought that when they saw him coming? He had to go looking for him. He had to ask somebody. He found him around a place called Dothan, which I don't know where that is. It's somewhere far away from their home. But they were pasturing the sheep there. They saw him coming. And before he even got there, they were discussing how they would kill him. That's how deep this hatred went. And you understand, they didn't just pull this out of thin air. There was a lot of bad history that had led to this moment in time. And they could get by with it because their dad wasn't around. So they're discussing ways that they can kill him. An incredibly dangerous mission for Jacob. He was oblivious to the fact that those brothers hated him that much. I guess he thought there's just no way they're going to hurt him. Boy, was he wrong about that. So the brothers, after a discussion, they decided they weren't going to kill him. Reuben, the oldest one, suggested they throw him into a cistern. And then when everybody got busy doing other things, they would leave. Reuben would go back to the cistern, pull Joseph out of the cistern, and take him home. Okay, that's not how this went. Reuben wasn't there. They threw him into a cistern. Reuben wasn't there when they sold him to a group of nomadic traders, all right, who were headed to Egypt to do some business. They sold him as a slave for 20 shekels of silver. And he was then sold to a man named Potiphar, who was the chief of the Pharaoh's army, the emperor of all of Egypt. And so that's how Joseph gets taken out of his household. The boys come up with this plan. They're going to kill one of the flock. They kill one of their own flock. It's the only thing I could figure they did. They killed one of their own goats. They smeared blood all over that coat. And they took the coat back to their dad and said, "Dad, this is all that's really left. This is it." And Jacob saw that and just went into the worst. He grieved for years and years and years, thinking that Joseph, his favored son, had been killed by a wild animal, because that's what his sons had led him to believe. Meanwhile, Joseph is in Egypt working for Potiphar. Joseph he's a very gifted administrator. He's very gifted. He starts out as just a regular slave in the household of Potiphar, but he's given increasing responsibilities. This must have taken several years. but he's given increasing responsibilities because then he becomes the chief servant over all of Potiphar's household. But he's a young man and he's handsome, and Potiphar's wife has a terrible crush on him. And she tries to seduce him on numerous occasions, and he refuses her. On one occasion, the last day that Joseph was there in Potiphar's house, Potiphar and the rest of the slaves were gone for some reason. They were out of the house, and she makes her move. And she says, come lay with me. Have sex with me. Come on, right now. Nobody's here. Let's do it now. Joseph, a holy man, a truly righteous man, he says, I can't do that. He said, your husband has given me responsibility of everything in this household except you. I cannot have you. It would not be right. And so she continues, and finally he wrests himself away from her, leaving, apparently has to pull his own cloak off so he can get away from her. And she's left there standing with the cloak. Well, there's the evidence, isn't it, of a false charge. Here we go. Well, when Potiphar gets back, she says, you know that slave you bought for me and for the household, that you've given so much responsibility? He tried to seduce me. Look, I got his coat. And Potiphar summarily throws him in dungeon, in a prison. And that's where Joseph spends the next years of his life, a good portion of his life, or a few years anyway. We do not know how long Joseph was in prison, but it's safe to say that he was there, I think, for several years. But he was known as a man who revered the Lord and could interpret dreams. His interpretations are always on point, but for all intents and purposes, he's been forgotten there. I'm leaving out a few of the details. The butler and the baker come to mind. But one night, Pharaoh, the Egyptian emperor, had a dream that absolutely terrified him. It was about fat, healthy cows who ate well, and then there's these ugly, skinny cows. The ugly, skinny cows eat the fat cows, but they don't get any fatter. They still look terrible. And then he dreams the next night, the Pharaoh does, about wheat. He sees these beautiful, healthy sheaves of wheat. He sees these scraggly, weedy sheaves of wheat, and these scraggly wheat sheaves eat these healthier sheaves of wheat, but they don't get any better looking. They still look skinny. And so Pharaoh is so terrified by this dream, he calls out into his court and his advisors, and he says, I got to find somebody to tell me what these dreams mean. These are freaking me out. Basically, they're freaking me out. Please find me someone who can do this. And you guys should be able to. And I said, no, we can't. We don't know how to interpret a dream like that. We have no clue. Well, one of the people in prison, who had been in prison with Joseph, who'd had his dream interpreted correctly, told Pharaoh, there's one guy in prison that can help you. He's full of the Spirit of God, of his God, and he can interpret your dream. And so they call Joseph up from prison. The scripture very clearly says they gave him a shave and a new change of clothes, because he wasn't fit to be presented to the emperor of Egypt. Probably bathed him too. By the way, the Egyptians shaved him because the Hebrews probably wore beards. The Egyptians always shaved. Okay? They always shaved. Proper Egyptian people shaved. So they shaved him, they got him in clothes, they bathed him, and they bring him to the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, they tell me that you can interpret this dream. Joseph says, well, God can. I can't, but God can tell me the meaning. And he tells him the dream, and Joseph says, well, what's going to happen is we're going to have 7 years of really good crops, followed by 7 really horrible years of drought. And Pharaoh's just gobsmacked. Well, what? This is terrible. But he looks on Joseph. He says, Joseph, you're such a wise man. He said, I'm going to promote you from jail inmate to the prime minister of Egypt. And in the greatest promotion in human history, from inmate in a prison to practically the president of his country in one fell swoop in one day. Okay? What a shave and a haircut can do for you, and getting out of prison too. So they bring Joseph out. Joseph devises this plan. He says, what we're going to do, and Pharaoh gives him absolute authority over the entire kingdom. He says, only one person that's higher in rank than Joseph, and that's me. So Joseph then develops this plan. We're going to harvest like crazy these 7 good years. We're going to harvest all the grain we can, and we are going to set aside a lot of that grain for the 7 years that are coming, the 7 years of drought. And so it says that Joseph built granaries. By the way, there are granaries in Egyptian archaeology. They've been finding them. Humongous granaries that could hold millions of bushels of grain. Egypt harvested aggressively for 7 years in those bumper crop years, saving all the grain they could. They were filled to overflowing with grain, okay, by the end of the 7 years. And then the drought hit. And the drought hits Jacob and his family and his sons in that household, finally. And Jacob basically tells his sons, he says, hey, you going to sit around here twiddling your thumbs all day, or are you going to get us some food before we starve to death? You need to go down to Egypt, and you need to buy us some grain. So Jacob loads them up with money, sends the boys down there to get grain, because they and their livestock are starving to death. Basically, it's a desperation move. Jacob's family can no longer sustain itself. Now, guess where these men ended up? They ended up right in front of Joseph, the governor of all of Egypt, because Joseph was in charge of the grain distribution for all of Egypt. And here are these guys who were responsible for selling him and throwing him into a cistern, threatening to kill him, and selling him into slavery, and all the misery that had happened in his life for all those years, through his later teen years up to his early 20s. Here he is, now the governor of Egypt, shaved and grown up. And the boys are there asking for grain. He's changed a lot. By the way, it had probably been, I don't post these verses, but Genesis 37:2 says that Joseph was 17 years old, okay, when he was sold into slavery, when the story begins. In Genesis 41:46, that it would have been 13 years after that. So we're talking about, and you're figuring 7 years of abundance and certain number of years of drought. So if you do the math, it's possible that Joseph was close to 40 years old. They hadn't seen him since he was 17. I'm just guesstimating, give or take a few years. We're looking in the late 30s, early 40s. Right. And so you're looking at 7 years of plenty. So they wouldn't have been there those 7 years. So it was at least 38 to 40 years of age. I'm guessing they probably lived a year or two on what they had stored. So Joseph would have been close to 40 years of age.
And the funny thing about it is, they didn't recognize him, but he recognized them.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah. 10 brothers. You can remember your voices too. Well, listen, here's the way the Bible tells the story. As soon as Joseph saw his brother, I want you to think about this in terms of forgiveness, okay? And the quickness of forgiveness. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and he spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. And although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them. He remembered these dreams that they hated him for, and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. No, my lord. They answered, your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. Oh, I bet Joseph was just aching to tell them something like that. Honest men, huh? Yeah, right. No, he said to them, you have come to see where our land is unprotected. But they replied, your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man, who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. One is no more. Joseph said to them, it's just as I told you, you are spies. And this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you're telling the truth. If you're not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. And he put them all in custody for 3 days. Think about that a minute. Stop the story. I wonder what it was like in that prison with those men after 3 days. I wonder if they wondered, are we ever getting out of here? What's going on? I mean, how long is this test going to take? Had Joseph forgiven these guys yet? I think that's a question. I'm not saying he did or he didn't, but it sure sounds strange.
I can tell you from experience, the first 24 hours, all you do is figure out what you should have done that you didn't do. And sit there and dwell on the fact that how
Yeah.
you could have not been in this situation.
Wha-
Thinking of their dad too, they're thinking, here we are, stuck in here, and either.
He doesn't even know, right? I don't have a cell phone to call home. Let him know where I'm at. I'm in jail. What am I going to do? Yeah. All we really have are the evidence of Joseph's actions. What he did was he threw them into prison for 3 days on no charge at all. Just threw them into jail on suspicion of being spies. There's no habeas corpus there, no due process. He threw them in jail just because he thought they looked like spies. Oh, no, Joseph knew who they were. So I'll just leave that one. I'll leave that one hanging in the midair. Had he forgiven them yet? Well, here's what was going on in the jail. On the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you're honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die.
This was the second trip that they made.
This is the first. This is the first. They're not quite gone yet. All they've done is gone up there to try to get some grain. Joseph says, I'll let you go back, but you can take the food back, but you got to bring your brother. But I'm keeping one brother as collateral while you make your trip to Canaan to deliver the grain. And this they proceeded to do. They said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. That almost brings tears to my eyes. This, to me, says how long had these guys felt the weight of guilt for what they had done, that they went to this immediately. This is why this is happening. We're being punished by God for having done this. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life. Now you're getting more of the story. That's not told in the story. These boys are telling us that Joseph begged them to spare his life. They had threatened over and over to kill him. And they're saying it right now. We saw that. We heard him beg for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us. Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy, but you wouldn't listen? Now we must give an accounting for his blood. They didn't realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter. Oh, isn't that neat? He learned a language while he was in prison. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. By the way, there's a rabbinical theory about why Simeon was the one taken. It was Simeon who most wanted him killed. That's what's commonly taught by Jewish teachers, is that Simeon wanted him dead worse than any of the other brothers. He hated him worse. That's the next oldest brother, right underneath Reuben. Now, what these men had done, they had not forgotten. Had they forgiven themselves? No, they had not. So they had guilty consciences. Is this a hint to forgiving others? Does this help us forgive others? That it is possible that many of the folks who do bad things to us later on in life realize that they did wrong by us. It's just fortunate that Joseph was able to understand Hebrew, and it was fortunate that he was able to overhear this conversation, because this is what had happened. In fact, it happened. Their consciences have been killing them for years. They saw their dad grieve a little every day. Think about that for a minute. What does that do to you? And later in the story, they're so desperate to fix this with their daddy. They're absolutely obsessed with fixing this. They have made a mess of this whole situation. There's something, I mentioned this last week, that Jesus, when he forgave the folks that crucified him, he said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." They don't know what they're doing. That sometimes that people do bad things to us because they honestly, truly do not know what they're doing. They just don't know. They don't understand the impact. Or they may think we deserve it. Some people treat us bad because they think we deserve it. In fact, I always warn people, and myself too, because I fall into this. Sometimes I think, well, they deserve to be treated bad. Oh, be careful. Be careful when you hear yourself saying that to yourself. We don't really know what we're doing.
Really, we all deserve that.
We do. We're treated better than we deserve, all of us, every single one of us. Well, there's more to the story, and we'll maybe get that in a later lesson, but suffice it to be enough to say here today that it appears forgiveness was given because the other sons were concerned about how Joseph would treat them, how Joseph was treated, that they relived those moments and punished themselves for those moments. And how often I think, and I have no way of knowing this except to know human nature and how God works in some people's lives, that folks suffer tremendously for the wrongs they do.
Sometimes it's to the point that they commit suicide.
Sometimes, yes. I think there were, and here's the end of the story, because, well, later, when they got there was some trickery involved, and Joseph really put them through the paces. Read the whole story. It's worth reading. It's a great read. But Joseph put them through all kinds of hell, quite literally, before finally revealing himself to his brothers. And he forgave them. He forgave them. And they wept, but they worried. They worried. When their daddy died, here's what happened. When their daddy died, it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." This granary saving program, this granary sale program, was all because of what had happened. God had used this situation. "So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. "So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." I repeated that verse, but I wanted to look at that one more time. That is assurance of forgiveness, isn't it? He's not only willing to release the wrong, now he's willing to take care of them. He's gone all the way to reconciliation. He didn't just forgive and release the wrong, he went to reconcile with them. And they were so penitent and so worried that they thought that when Dad died, that Joseph was holding back his anger on account of Dad, and that now that Dad was dead, we're in trouble. And so they sent messengers to Joseph. They were so afraid. And then when they showed up, they just said, "We're your slaves." Yeah.
That's what Jacob did to Esau when he returned to him.
Yes. And there's another great example, I think, of forgiveness. Here's a couple of secrets. We're gonna, quick lessons here because we got about 5 minutes. One of the things that Joseph said was, "Am I in the place of God?" Joseph, this is one thing about forgiveness we always have to come back to. I think this is one of the secrets of forgiving the big things. You know you're not God. It's not your responsibility to bring about justice to the people who've wronged you. It's God's responsibility, and he takes that responsibility very seriously. He's a just and righteous God. He will take care of that. And it's best that we leave that to him. There's a passage in Romans 12. It says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what's right in the sight of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge. I will repay,' says the Lord." So Joseph, he never heard the words of Apostle Paul, but he was already practicing them, right? He said, "Am I in the place of God?" It's God's job to be wrathful. It's not his personal responsibility. The second thing that I see is that he saw God's ability to use the wrongs that were done to him for a greater good. That actually providence is at work, even in the bad things that happen to us. That's hard to believe. I'm not going to tell you that's easy. Because if someone were to come to me after I'd been wronged and say, "God's about to use this for your good," I wouldn't believe it. It would be too hard to accept right off the bat. I know from personal experience. I've been told after horrible things have happened, "Oh, God will use this for good." And I just want to, well, I don't see how. I don't know how this could be. It's a hard thing to believe that God can use bad things that happen to us for greater goods. And Joseph fully understood that and said so. He said, "What happened, God has used to accomplish this great thing. We're feeding the whole world." He wasn't saying it was good that they did it. It says that God used it, though. And that's Romans 8:28, right? In everything, God works for the good of those who love him, who are the called according to his purpose. I'll go you one step further. In Romans 8:28, God does not only work in everything for the good of those that love him, but he can do exceedingly abundantly more than just for you. He can do a lot of good for others too, in the bad that happens to you. Okay? Great story. You need to read the whole thing. But Genesis 37 through 50 is a great read. It's a great read. All right, we'll let you go. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.